Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, the Institute's president, and it is a great pleasure to bring everyone together today for a presentation of some of our ongoing research on a very serious set of issues. How do we keep cyclical unemployment from turning into structural inequality? I wish I could say we had the answer. We don't, but we have some preliminary answers that I hope will shape the current policy debate and also the research agenda going forward. My colleagues, David Blanchflower, Jacob Kierkegaard, and Thomas Hillebrand will be speaking about this shortly. Some of you may have noticed, and I'm glad to see some of you back, this is the latest in a series of events we've been doing since January, focused on the labor market side of things, on social issues, and on some welfare in the broad economic sense issues. The Institute has, of course, always been concerned with these aspects of globalization, but I'm delighted that we've recommitted to that in a new way over the past year. Part of that was under our project on ethics and globalization, which Howard Rosen and Stephen Wiseman led with support from the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. Part of that, however, and ongoing, is thanks to the support of the Aranda Foundation, which gave us a major grant to look at inequality in a global context and inclusive capitalism. And this is the work that Thomas and Jacob and Danny are doing, is all supported by that grant and by their ongoing energy. And we're grateful to Lynn and Evelyn Rothschild, Lynn, a member of our Institute's executive committee of the board, for supporting us in this effort. As I said a few months ago, the discussion of globalization and inequality tends sometimes to be like farmers complaining about the weather. It's going to rain or it's not going to rain. There really isn't anything you can do about it. There is, however, a belief that you can do something about inequality, even if the integration of China and Eastern Europe into the global economy does have some effects on labor markets, even if technology means that some people who used to be considered high-skilled are more replaceable than they were. And I think it's important for us and everyone to try to get beyond sort of just railing against the weather and start thinking about what kinds of umbrellas and what kinds of roofs and what kinds of forecasting we should be doing instead. And that's what today's effort is about. We have three presentations. I will do the introductions first so as not to break the flow. The first is by our senior fellow, Jacob von Kierkegaard, with the cheery title, When Structural Labor Market Reforms Work Well, The Case of Germany. Many of you know Jacob as the leading commentator on the Euro crisis, perhaps in the US, star of stage and screen, friend to surplus countries around the world. Jacob is the one who keeps the German embassy from filing formal complaints against me, so I'm very glad of that. But in all seriousness, Jacob has been with the Institute since 2002, recently received his PhD from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, has published many works, and importantly, much of his ongoing research has been on the comparative labor markets, comparative pension policies, comparative social economic initiatives, particularly in the OECD economies. And he's going to make what I think is quite a compelling case that it is possible to do labor market reforms without corroding inequality. Second speaking will be Thomas Hillebrand. This is Thomas's premiere on our stage, and I'm very proud of him that he's doing that. Thomas joined the Institute in January 2013. Previously, he was at the Bank of England, where you might have guessed he worked for me for part of the time as an economist in the External Monetary Policy Committee. But he had previously worked both at the Bank of England and Office of National Statistics, done a lot of work on fiscal policy, on consumer behavior, is a very good, honest data hound, which is what we love. And interestingly, for those of you who read Slovakian, he is the author of one of the best-read economics blogs in Slovakia. He is keeping his hand in his home country's public debate while broadening his experience here with us, and we're delighted he's doing that. Thomas will be speaking today cross-sectionally across the Great Recession, looking at a bunch of advanced economies. How has unemployment affected inequality? And some of it, the bottom line of it's not good is sort of obvious, but there are some subtle points and differences that point us towards institutional responses that Thomas brings out, and I think you'll benefit greatly from his work. Finally, on our panel today is David G. Blanchflower, known to me and thousands of Twitter followers as Danny. Danny is another ex-Bank of England person. He was a member of the Monetary Policy Committee from June 2006 through June 2009, the height of the crisis. He's also the Bruce V. Rauner Professor of Economics at Dartmouth, where he's been since 2001. He's now a non-resident senior fellow working with us part-time as part of the Inequality Project, the Randa Foundation funds. And he remains a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, an active columnist in the British and the World Press, a contributing editor for Bloomberg TV, and still actually runs his own regressions. So this is quite a figure. Danny is going to take on the differences between the UK and the US employment and inequality responses to the Great Recession, which, to a first approximation, is a very interesting comparison to make, given that these are both supposed to be the countries with highly liberalized, free labor markets, and they behaved very differently. And he's going to preview some work that he and I have been doing on, is there any wage growth anywhere that monetary policymakers should worry about, the link between wages and inequality. So we have our three panelists, and then we're looking forward to an exciting discussion with all of you here in our expert audience. Our friends online can view it. I'll come back with some concluding remarks before we open it up for questions. But first, let me call on Jacob Kierkegaard.
Well, thank you, Adam. And it is, of course, as Adam said, a particular pleasure for me to actually take the stage and hopefully deliver, some pretty good news, because I actually think that Germany does have a fairly compelling case with respect to labor market reforms that has worked and has, as importantly as Adam said, not worked at the expense of the lowest income groups in the country. And I think this is a particular relevant discussion, not just in Europe right now, but more broadly and also in the United States, because when we think about structural reforms, we tend to basically think of something that is the equivalent of rolling back the social safety nets. And I think Germany is actually a case of showing that you can actually do very effective labor market reforms without necessarily doing that. And then, as Adam also alluded to, maybe I also hope to show that at least some of the critiques that are often leveled at Germany are not quite as true as many people would like them to be. So I want to start a little bit about what has actually happened, because I think it's important to really underline just literally how good has the German employment and labor market trends been. Then I want to talk a little bit about what actually happened in Germany, because I think that's often misunderstood, and perhaps equally important about what didn't happen in Germany, and then a little bit about the distributional effects in Germany at the end. So starting with just a structural indicator that I really like to use, labor force participation. What I have here is working age labor force participation. So those of you who are used to looking at US numbers for 16 or 15 and above, these numbers are different because they're capped. But what you basically see is that Germany really is the standout country. Just in level terms, Germany is now in working age labor force participation where the United States was in the, at the end of the roaring 1990s. Well over 75%. And actually, as you can see, there is an indication of a break around 2005. You can also see that Germany actually isn't the only country in the euro area that have seen, quite in contrast to the United States, rising labor force participation since the crisis began. So if you look at this chart, if people were to tell you that the Spanish labor force participation for the working age is actually higher than in the US today, that may surprise some, I would say. And it also means that one should be a little careful with comparing short-term unemployment figures, because these unemployment figures will invariably be affected by the changes in participation that we have seen, so that they clearly, in my opinion, tend to overestimate unemployment figures in Europe and underestimate them in the United States. The same is true when you look at employment rates. Again, you can see that Germany really is the standout country. It is, again, on these figures, about where the United States was in the late 1990s. And we can also see that the historical outperformance on the historical element, that the US always had better labor market performance than the euro area. You go back to the 1990s. The reason that these data only starts in 1998 is that's when the data starts. You will see that the US used to be 10, 15 percentage points higher than the euro area as a whole. Today, that gap is about 2%. And of course, you will see that when you look at employment rates in Spain, they're very different than the participation rates, of course. But by and large, again, it really is important to underline just how good the German performance has been. If you look at who has actually benefited, well, here you break down the increase in the employment rates from when the reforms in Germany were almost fully implemented by the first quarter of 2005 till today, and you will see that the increase is very broad. And not least is it extremely high among older workers. This is not a coincidence. This is by design. It's gone up by more than 20 percentage points employment rates from the 60 to 64-year-olds of both genders in Germany, which is precisely what you would want in a country that has a rapidly aging population, and of course also in terms of employing older workers before 2005, a pretty appalling starting point, which was what Germany most certainly had. You can also look at another metric. This is the beverage curves for Germany. And what you can see here is actually that if you start all the way down, now I think that I actually put in the wrong numbers or the wrong time points here, but if you go down to the lower right corner for you, that's actually the first quarter of 2005. So basically on a beverage curve or a labor market matching efficiency metric, Germany has more or less improved ever since and has clearly moved to a period where there are fewer firms reporting labor shortages and a lower level of unemployment. So something quite clearly happened here. And I think, by and large, a good story. So what did they do? Here, I think the best way to understand it is that German labor market reforms was comprehensive in nature. Unfortunately, that means that I don't have time to go into details about the specific components of them, but just to say that in some ways, analytically, and at least politically, it's a challenge because so many changes were made that I would argue that individual commentators tend to focus on the particular changes that they ideologically like. So there's no doubt that Germany, for instance, cut with the Hartz IV reforms, cut the long-term unemployment benefits and thereby lowered the reservation wage for German unemployed. Absolutely, that was a component. But it is also very clear that Germany also reformed thoroughly work search and retraining as part of this. So the key thing to understand here, in my opinion, really is that these reforms were comprehensive in nature. It is also quite clear that wage restraint was part of this equation. What I plotted here are the hourly manufacturing wages index. The red line there in the middle is Germany. So it's relative to German developments after 1999. So wage restraint is absolutely there. But I think it is very important to understand, or at least in my opinion, not to exaggerate the implications of wage restraint. And the idea that it was all wage restraint and nothing else really mattered is, in my opinion, a misguided notion, because what you can see is that there's no doubt that hourly manufacturing wages rose dramatically more in the two housing bubble countries, Ireland and Spain, during this period. than they did in Germany, but it's also clear that they didn't rise that much more in countries like Italy or France. There's no data on this metric in the OECD database for Greece, but a very interesting element is, what about Portugal? In fact, Portuguese hourly manufacturing wages since the entry into the euro were flat, and therefore actually fell relative to German wage level. So the idea that, the chart that we always see, that unit labor costs in Germany have developed have basically been flat, but gone up everywhere else dramatically in the euro area, that is solely due to sort of aggressive German wage restraint and beggar thy neighbor policies, I think is an empirically challenged idea. And more importantly, there's also a level issue involved here, because the idea that Germany is a low-wage country is just demonstratively untrue, in my opinion, even after this relative period of wage restraint. And that's what the total wage levels that you see here indicates. And I put in here just both the gross wages, which is what workers are paid, and then the additional social contributions and benefits that employers pay to illustrate the fact that Germany over this period was not a country that tried to basically cut labor costs by gutting the social safety net. So in that sense, it is not a right-to-work state in the euro area. And equally important in a broad sense, that this increase in employment and broad labor utilization, the labor utilization metric that I like to use is hours per capita, not per hour per worker or anything, but per capita. It's the broadest possible metric. The increase that you saw in Germany since 2005 did not come at the expense of productivity. In fact, Germany achieved both increases in broad labor utilization and in productivity. Here that I use GDP per hour. Whereas you can see that in most other countries, there tends to be a trade-off between the two, except in France, where actually, in France, they declined throughout the period since 1999. This, of course, immediately, to me at least, suggests that the idea that most of the jobs that were created when more people were brought into the German labor market were marginal low-wage jobs, that I don't think is verified by the rise in productivity. But speaking a little bit about the distributive issues here, first of all, it's very important to understand that Germany has created a sizable number of, the way these numbers are collected, these are jobs with full social insurance attached to them. That number has actually gone up by more than 3 million since early 2005, a period in which registered unemployment declined by only about 2 million. So you have actually a significant shift of people from inactivity into jobs with full social insurance, which is precisely what you would want. Now, many of you may have heard about this creation of the so-called mini-jobs or low-wage jobs in Germany. But I would argue that a lot of the rhetoric and discussion about this issue is based on a faulty reading of the statistics and a faulty understanding of precisely what the changes made during the so-called Hartz II reform actually implemented. Because you may have heard that Germany now has 7.5 million low-wage mini-jobs, and they only had about 5 million in 2005. That is true. But it's important to understand that a so-called mini-job is a job that can pay a maximum of 400 euros a month. So it is definitely, on a monthly basis, low wage. But there's no hourly maximum attached to this job. So, and it also, in 2000, when this change was made, a very crucial change to the law was made so that you could actually have a job, a fully socially insured job, and a mini job on the side as a second job without paying contributions, social contributions for the full wage sum, which translates into that a mini job as a side job has a very, very low marginal tax rate. So what this chart shows you is essentially that the entire increase in German mini jobs has come from the new opportunity to have these jobs as a second side job, whereas the actual mini jobs as just the only job is actually quite flat. And the green line here suggests that it has not come at the expense of fully insured job. So by and large, the expansion of the German mini job category, I don't believe can be claimed to have created a very significant new working poor class in Germany. Now, I will go very quickly here because Adam is giving me the 1 minute. But just to say that Germany still has a lot of work to do here, because what this chart shows is that Germany has a significant much higher number of men working full-time compared to women. So Germany clearly needs to make a number of changes to fix this as we go forward. That is the challenge that is in front of the new Grand Coalition. Now, this, in my opinion, has to do with things like maternity leave, childcare opportunities, but also changes to the German tax law, where you have this interesting system that the household tax code is actually based on the average earnings of the two people, if there is two people working in the household, which of course means that the marginal tax rate for the second earner is extremely high. We can talk about that in the Q&A. But just to say that there is still work to be done in Germany. But by and large, the summary of these remarks are that you can actually have it all. You can have it all if you do it properly. You can increase labor supply, employment, labor utilization, productivity, and labor market matching. And you can do it without necessarily aggravating inequality in the economy to a noticeable extent. Thank you very much.
I will restrain comment and turn to Thomas. Let's see if we can get your slide up. Where are we? Hello, Brant. I'm a multi-talented manager. There you go.
Thank you very much, Adam, for your kind introduction, and let me add my thanks to Evelyn and Lynn for their generous support. The topic of my presentation is income inequality and how it has changed in the Great Recession, and I'm going to use the Luxembourg income study microdata to assess this question. I will show that the change in earnings inequality amongst those who are employed has not changed very much in most countries. But once we extend the analysis to include all those people who are unemployed or inactive, the impact of falling employment in many countries is significant. I then turn to mechanisms which tend to mitigate inequality in living standards within societies operating through the family and through social transfer programs. I show that redistribution within households became more important, particularly relative to pre-crisis trends. And on social programs, I show that there's an important difference between work-related social insurance programs and means-tested benefits. A few words about the data. The Luxembourg income study has data on 39 countries at 3 to 5 year intervals. For 10 of these countries, we have data for 2010, and these are the countries I focus on. The sample size is quite large, and data is available on a large number of income sources, both at individual and household level. Now, survey data do have some problems. In particular, surveys of income tend to sample low incomes and underreport high incomes. Furthermore, certain sources of income are underreported, particularly capital and social transfers. Before turning to inequality, I compared changes in employment rates among the working age individuals between 2007 and 2010 with official data from labor force surveys. There are some discrepancies between the two surveys, particularly in Greece, so the Greek results should be taken with some caution. In the analysis that follows, I make extensive use of the Gini coefficient to measure income inequality. The Gini Index is derived from the Lorenz curve, which plots the proportion of total income on the y-axis that is cumulatively earned by the bottom X% of the population. And the Gini Index is given by the area G, the ratio of the area G to the triangle ABC. So I begin by focusing only on income and only amongst those people who are in work. And I look at the change in the Gini Index between 2007 and 2010. Now, in this chart, note that Italy and Slovenia are not comparable to the other countries because these two data sets are based on income net of tax, while the other countries' data is in gross terms. So with the exception of Greece, the absolute change has been modest in all countries in our sample. In some countries, the change relative to the continuation of pre-crisis trend is somewhat larger. Now, this is not to say that the impact of the recession has had a uniform impact across individuals, but to the extent that differences exist, they appear to be broadly offsetting in terms of overall earnings inequality. In the next step, I expand the sample to include all those working-age individuals who are not employed, to assess the direct effect of changes in employment on inequality in labor income. To this end, I use a decomposition of the Gini Index into a contribution from changing in earnings amongst the employed and a contribution from changes in the employment rate. As you can see, the latter completely dominate the former in a majority of countries most affected by the Great Recession. The effect of falling employment on inequality is significant. To put these changes into context, using a larger sample of 20 advanced economies around mid-2000s, the Gini Index on earnings ranged from around 50 in Denmark, Norway and Sweden to 61 in the US and 64 in Ireland. So a 2 Gini points increase is roughly a fifth of the way between Denmark and the US. In Germany and Luxembourg, whose labor markets fared well in the recession, as we've heard from Jacob, there has been a little change in earnings inequality. But ultimately, what we're interested in when we assess inequality in living standards between countries, we're interested not in gross earnings, but in total income, including social transfers and net of tax. Moreover, we want to recognize that significant redistribution happens within households as family members share common resources. The family and the state, therefore, have some scope to mitigate the increase in inequality in individual earnings. To assess the role of households, I assume that they share total earnings equally between members and look at whether the effect of this redistribution has changed between 2007 and 2010. I focus on households headed by a working-age individual. This chart suggests that, relative to the continuation of pre-crisis trend of falling redistribution within households, there has been a significant increase in 3 of the peripheral economies, Spain, Greece, and Italy, and also in Slovakia, Slovenia, and a significant reduction in Luxembourg. It is important to note that the ability of households to mitigate the effects of rising unemployment on inequality is greater in larger households and when more household members work. For example, when one member of a 2-earner household loses his or her job, the impact on aggregate earnings inequality is lower than when the sole breadwinner is made redundant, because in the former case, the earnings of the remaining employed member can be shared. This is what seems to have happened in the recession to many households in Spain and Slovakia, and to a lesser extent in some of the other countries, as this chart suggests. So there's a rise in the share of single breadwinner households on the x-axis relative to trend is positively related to the change in redistribution within households relative to trend. In Greece and Italy, these are countries where the share of single breadwinner households was already high before the crisis. Increased redistribution within households seems to be related more to increases in average household size. This may reflect actions by families designed to reduce living costs through economies of scale, such as increased incidence of young people continuing to live with their parents. Ireland is a bit of an anomaly in that the household size fell relative to trend. So why do Irish households appear not to have sought increased sharing of living costs? The answer may have to do with the structure of the social safety nets in Ireland, and namely the importance of means-tested benefits. So this brings me to the role of government in redistribution. In this chart uses a method of decomposing the Gini Index by income source. And I want you to focus on the red and the green bars. They illustrate an important difference within the category of social transfers between social insurance benefits, where eligibility and the level of benefits is tied to previous earnings and employment tenure, and social transfers that are means tested in the green bars, where eligibility is determined by need rather than by previous contributions or work history. The former contribute positively to the change in income inequality, and the latter tend to mitigate the rise in income inequality. I decompose each of these in the following two slides. This chart shows that the positive contribution of the work-related social insurance is driven by pensions, and this may reflect decisions by individuals within some of these countries to make use of early retirement opportunities while they still exist. Turning to the means-tested social assistance, this chart shows that the contribution is driven by unemployment assistance and maternity and child benefits. And Ireland stands out as particularly generous. This is consistent with OECD analysis, which shows that, for example, the net income of single social assistance recipients, excluding housing benefits, reaches on average around 40% of median income in Ireland, compared to only 30% in Spain, 20% in the UK, and only 7% in the US. This last chart confirms that there's a meaningful relationship between the change in inequality in total income relative to pre-crisis trend and change in the employment rate relative to trend. So the labor market clearly matters for inequality outcomes. In conclusion, the LIS data suggests that a limited effect of the Great Recession on earnings inequality amongst those who remain in employment. Across the whole working age population, earnings inequality has increased in some countries driven by falling employment. Part of this is clearly cyclical, but there may be important effects on inequality in the longer run due to hysteresis effects. And this is an interesting topic for future research. The Great Recession seems to have reversed or slowed the pre-crisis trend of diminishing redistribution within households, as the share of single breadwinner households and household size have increased. And lastly, work-related social insurance, particularly pensions, have tended to exacerbate the rise in inequality, while means-tested benefits have tended to mitigate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Allow me to just make two quick notes. First, as Thomas pointed out in some of the slides you saw there is a lot more detail, obviously, to this research, and we will be releasing over the next few weeks a series of policy briefs by these authors, which goes into the evidence in more detail and dots the I's and crosses the T's. The second thing is that Lynn has rightly set us the challenge of trying to come up with a cleaner, more easily comprehensible, and more concise indicator than the Gini Index for trying to capture relative inequality measures, and we're dealing with that. But I don't want anyone to think because Thomas's presentation was in terms of the Gini Index that that's where we're stopping. We want to think of a better way of presenting and analyzing this information. The final point is I would just like to draw out an important echo between something Jacob was saying and something that Thomas was saying. Both of them were stressing that there are forms of social welfare state and there are forms of labor market intervention that can coexist with even large adjustments in the labor market. So not even just the good news of Germany, but that in Ireland can make massive progress on its fiscal deficit, massive changes to its wage rates, and competitiveness and still be maintaining means-tested benefits versus work-related benefits. And it's unpacking these kinds of institutional differences and the impact they have on inequality is a major purpose of our project. With that in mind, go back to some of the subtleties of differences. I'll call on Danny Blanchflower to present his work. Why don't you grab yourself your glass of water since you seem to be coughing?
Thank you. This is an early stage of work we have been doing on comparing labor markets. And we have lots of puzzles and inconsistencies across the two countries and other countries. But I think the bottom line of the similarity between them is the evidence that appears to be that there is enormous downward pressure on wages everywhere, and this is unlikely to change anytime soon. And I'm going to show you some new evidence that we have on that suggests to us that it's going to be a very long time before wages start to rise, and monetary policy makers can take this very seriously and perhaps keep going. And my view increasingly is that actually the indicator of the labour market that policymakers should look at is not unemployment, is not the underemployment rate, is not the participation rate, but it's actually wages. And we'll get to that in a tick. To put this in context, the puzzle that you face, and in a sense Jacob's work is actually very nice for this, because I'm faced with this puzzle. I'm comparing the UK with the US. And what you get in the UK is a huge, this is a shock in the first column, a huge 7 percentage point or so shock to output in the deep recession. And that output has not recovered. We're still around 2.5%, 3% or so below. Germany has this bigger shock even than the US. Output has recovered and employment has recovered. Okay, so that's a counter to this. But the big story in the US actually is that even though it was a relatively small shock, compared to the UK, output has been restored. But exactly the reverse is true when I tell you the story in the labour market. I've put a series of slides, and I won't go through all of them, but people can look at the series of slides. And it's true that the unemployment rate in the US rose markedly. If you look at the US non-farm payroll numbers or the employment rate, what you see is even though output has been restored, employment has not been restored. And exactly the reverse is true in the UK, where we haven't restored output, but we have restored the total number of jobs. Obviously, the employment rates in both countries are nothing like what they were, and partly it's because there's been actually a growth in population, a growth in 16-plus population, and some of this research has to deal with the fact, particularly for youngsters and others across countries, there are very large cohort effects. So there's a lot of complicating stories that go on here. I'm only going to spend a little time, but we have a couple of really interesting puzzles for the US which warrant attention. So if you're going to talk about inequality, you have to worry about the young and the old and so on, and we're going to think about that. But one of the stories that faces us with a puzzle in the US compared to the UK is actually what you've seen here is that the US, compared with virtually every European country, doesn't actually have a youth unemployment problem. And compared with everybody else, youth unemployment rates are not so high and have actually fallen. But there's a kicker to that on the other side, which is because youth is a smaller share of the unemployment stock in the US than they've been in the past, and youth spells tend to be short, what we've had here is that the US now starts to look like European countries and look like countries in Europe in the 80s. We see a rise in long-duration unemployment. So obviously these things are a little complicated, and I'm going to deal with those. But the focus I want to make here today is to think about what's happening to real wages, nominal wages even, but real wages especially. So we'll start with the UK, and if you start from our wage curve research, there's nothing in the research prior to 2008 or so that tells you that wages are more flexible in the UK than they are in the US. All the estimates suggest that they're about the same. But the background story is the pattern of real wage growth across countries has been really pretty different. So the story here is so this is 2001 to 2008, what you see in the UK is substantial real wage growth, and Larry Katz and Gary Loveman and I wrote a whole series of papers on this in the early days, so the 80s and 90s, and you saw across the distribution in the UK a growth in real wages. And we're going to focus more about what happens to wage growth across the distribution. This just happens to be the mean, but you see there was real wage growth across the distribution. And now all of a sudden in the UK, we've seen since 2008, you've had this 10-year period of real wage growth. Then what you get in the UK is this enormous drop in real wages. Real wages are now down 8% compared to where they were at the start of the recession. And currently nominal wage growth is 0.6%. And the CPI is at 2.7. So annually at the moment, you have 2.1% real wage drops, and with no real sign that this is going to improve. You actually have a story rather strong, somewhat different to that in the US, and in fact, I can show you a little bit more, that there has been some drops in real wages, but nothing like the degree to which they were in the UK. But this is the great thing with this kind of work is data comes out. This came out yesterday, so I thought I'd throw this at you from yesterday. The story in the US, so this is usual weekly earnings, but the story I like from this slide is I gave you the story in the UK, real hourly wage growth from 2001. Well, what you see here is real wages expressed in constant dollars today are approximately the same as they were in 2004. But the reality here is even though we've seen a drop since 2009 or so, I think the story that perhaps will surprise people is even during the good times when unemployment was low and all the rest of it, we saw no real wage growth at the middle. And we obviously have to worry about this at the extremes. So the focus and the reality, and Jacob talked about this as well, the reality is that no real wage growth in the US, declining real wages fast in the UK, and declining real wage growth in most European countries. What's going on? So we've been doing a number of pieces of work, some with Adam, some with Andrew Oswald, some with David Bell, and I'm just going to go through some of it. And all of this work suggests, in my view, the natural rate of unemployment is lower than we thought, there's no wage pressure, and we're not going to see any for a while. So let's just start with the first one. I'm going to do home ownership rates. And I think that shows actually very bad negative externalities on the labour market. I give a presentation here, and more recent work has confirmed that. I'm going to talk about the participation rate work and about underemployment and think about what it says for wages. So this work on home ownership is, I was on a program with Judd Gregg on Bloomberg the other day, and I presented this work, and he said, it's un-American to present the work on home ownership. And the interviewer said, well, he's from England. But anyway, maybe it is un-American, but you're from England, you can do this, you see. So this turns out to be that actually in the data we have, it turns out that the principal determinant, I mean, it's hard to find any other determinant, the principal determinant actually of unemployment is actually a lagged home ownership rate. So the rise in the home ownership rate in our paper actually raises unemployment. We can show it lowers employment, it reduces firm creation rates, establishment creation rates, it lowers mobility, and it raises commuting times. And the evidence seems to, and we've controlled in lots of the work that we've done, we've controlled for cyclical fluctuation, temporary fluctuations. I'm going to quickly give it to the technical, I'll move from it. But the kind of specification that you get for the technical ones amongst us is that you can run an unemployment equation across states and years, control for state effects, control for year effects. You get a nice long lag working something like home ownership in the state in T-5, raises unemployment in the state. And that's independent of the cycle. So our view is actually, the estimates we make are that the rise in the home ownership rate during the 2000 period approximately raises the natural rate by a percentage point. And for us, it's really good that the home ownership rate's coming down, because that suggests that the natural rate, really good, is going to come down. That should get people going. But anyway, well, this is supposed to be controversial. This is what we're trying to do. Okay, so the second part. So that's the first thing. It looks that home ownership rate now coming down is good for the natural. This is about the natural rate, not about temporary things. I'm happy to send people the paper. The second thing is that I was at a conference a bit ago, and I made a bit of a twit of myself, which is that Andy Levin gave this paper saying, in their theory paper, that participation rates, the non-participants were pushing down on wages. And I said, well, it was really easy to do it, you ought to do it. And I've estimated wage equations forever. Participation rates don't enter the wage equations. So I said that, and I said, well, just go try it. So I went home and tried it, and went, oops, I was wrong. So it turns out that actually, and Jacob was right again, that across countries, participation rates have actually risen. You see in Euro area they've risen, in France they've risen, Germany a little bit, Sweden they've risen, the UK they've risen, but in the US they have not. Well, it turns out that what we have actually discovered now is that rise in the decline in the non-participation rate actually impacts on wages, and no one's seen this before. So I'm going to take you to the specification that Adam and I produced in this paper now. It turns out, all the many moons I worked on wages being pushed down by the unemployment rate, this is the first column, is the standard thing that people have seen from our wage curves book and endless things that we've done, which is that the unemployment rate pushes down on wages. But it turns out, I want to rewrite the participation rate as an inactivity rate, so I can think of slack. More inactivity means more slack. It means a negative sign. So it's the 100 minus the participation rate. And what you get is this inactivity rate pushes down on wages, and in fact, in the latest period, it pushes down on wages even further. So there's double sets of downward pressure on wages. These non-participants that we're seeing are pushing wages down. And Jacob again said, that the measure of the unemployment rate in the US is not such a great measure of slack, because you've got to take account of the participation rate. And this equation said, I'll be fine, I'll be great. This equation actually suggests that. It's exactly suggestive of that fact. So, natural rates come down, wages aren't going to rise at all, the economy is more mobile, non-participants are pushing down on wages, the high unemployment rate is pushing down on wages. But it turns out we have some other evidence, and I'm going to give you a bit of evidence for the UK, because I've been quite interested in what the insiders will do. So what are the insiders going to do? Are they going to generate wage pressure or not? In the US, we have a series, which is the underemployment rate, but it's not actually very interesting, because it almost tracks perfectly the unemployment rate, so you just sort of ignore it. But it turns out in the UK, I have this other series, which is really quite interesting. We can't do it for the US. And the question we ask people is, would you like to work a different number of hours than the ones that you're working? If so, more or less, how many? So then you can calculate how many extra or less hours people would like to work. Well, look at this. So this is what you get from the period 2000 to 2007. The red line is the total number of hours, aggregated hours in a year, that the workers would like to work less. The blue line is the aggregate number of hours that people would like to work more. Most countries report part-timers who are part-time because they'd like to be full-time. But the benefit of this measure is you ask everybody. You ask full-timers, how many hours have you got, and would you like more? Okay. So what turns out is, after 2007, I've got about 2 minutes and I'll be done. To 2007, roughly, the two series move together, and then you have this big widening. And so the bottom line, it turns out, is this underemployment index broadens. And what's interesting is this is people, the insiders, if you like, at a time of rising hours and falling real wages, want to work more hours at the going wage. So the inference is, when the recovery comes, no wage pressure, the unemployment rate doesn't go down, but hours rise at the going wage. So there's no wage pressure. Unemployment rates don't come down anywhere near fast, but hours rise. So, conclude, I've got about 2 minutes. Can I just go through my conclude slide? I'm really there. And I want to think about inequality. I'm really trying to get to, we're seeing this pressure at the middle. I mean, obviously, home ownership, participatory rates, underemployment rates look to be really important. And we want to worry about these pressures. Are the pressures the same at the low end of the distribution, in the middle? What about participation rate? Is it different for old people's participation rate, younger ones? But it certainly appears that flat or even full, I mean, if we're talking about inequality, obviously it matters what the distribution is. It also matters if actually this inequality is in the world of falling real wages or rising real wages. So I want to do a lot more work thinking about the implications on inequality. But this work seems pretty important, because the one similarity, it seems to me, and I'm the wage guy, I've been doing this is the wage curve, I've been doing this since 1982 or something, and this is remarkable to me. Everything that I see suggests that there's a lot more room for the Fed and the MPC to stimulate the economy before any wage pressure. And I would obviously say the same thing with a Fed meeting, with an ECB meeting coming tomorrow. Boy, is that true in Germany and in France and in Italy and every place else. So it seems to me that the amount of slack in the labour market is enormous. The pressure is downwards on wages, and it seems to me a great puzzle for our age is not so much even what happens to inequality, but what are we going to do about the median worker/voter? The end.